the idea for this afternoon's sessions was kind of a three-parter. We want to look at what the states can do, even though our overall theme was the next 4 years under in the Biden era, which is all federal. But the states obviously is where most justice is being done right now. We want to look at the different parts of the menu, ranging from probation reform to jail reform. And the other big part of it, the third part of it, is really reentry. How do you handle it? How do you get through the barriers? And that's one of the huge issues that we write about. And to get into that a little bit, I want to bring up a really special guest. Washington State occupies a special place in the criminal justice reform. For those of you who haven't been following it, last year I introduced to our live Guggenheim audience Jeremiah Bourgeois, who is a columnist for the Crime Report. He left prison last year after spending 14 years inside. He's now studying law at Gonzaga University, and he managed to overcome all the barriers that you would normally see. He's now, as I say, in his first year of studying law. His ebook of columns for TCR, in fact, is still available for sale. It's a quick plug on our site. There's a link on our site you can take a look at. But this year there was another extraordinary story out of Washington State. It would be remarkable enough to spotlight the journey of Tarra Simmons from a fast food worker to a state legislator. It's one of those reporters' dream stories, but the backstory is even more interesting because Tarra spent 3 years in prison. She overcame countless barriers of reentry to be elected the first former incarcerated to hold state office in Washington. And not surprisingly, she's become a champion of reforming reentry and probation and a leading voice of justice reform. She spoke with me. She couldn't make our symposium today, but she spoke with me on a Zoom call earlier this month. So I want to bring her up now at a pre-recorded interview. It's about 20 minutes. I think you'll find it really stimulating and inspiring. So if we can start that up, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me today. It is an honor to be here. I, am very fortunate to be in this situation where I'm in today, and it's been a really hard journey. I, like so many other people who've been to prison, suffered with a lot of childhood trauma, substance use disorder, violent poverty, family, generational cycles of incarceration. And when I went to prison, I was a registered nurse and I owned a home, and all of the collateral consequences I faced when I was trying to reenter were really difficult. I ended up, working at a minimum wage job, and they were garnishing my paycheck for the legal financial obligations that everybody gets when you're sentenced to a crime. So I have been working on that. Also, just the discrimination people face in employment and housing and voting and trying to get your life back on track. So, I overcame a lot of barriers in order to be where I'm at today. But one of the things I did was go to law school, and then that was another barrier. At first they wouldn't let me sit for the bar exam because of my criminal history. And fortunately, I have been connected to a national network of other formerly incarcerated leaders. And, Sean Hopwood, professor at Georgetown Law School, came out and represented me in the Supreme Court, and I was able to overcome that barrier and become an attorney. Yeah. And so, I've had to overcome a lot of barriers myself, and I'm really just working to try to remove those for other people.
So let's start with the hard part. I mean, what were the barriers you faced? I mean, your own good character, your redemption or rehabilitation in prison didn't count for anything once you got outside. Apparently.
No, that's the problem, is the stigma of a criminal record is a lifelong punishment. It's a lifetime sentence to poverty, really. And, I wasn't going to accept that, not for myself, my family, my children, but also for the overwhelming amount of people in my community who are suffering with that lifetime sentence of poverty. And it's something I'm still fighting for today. We've made some progress here in Washington, but it continues.
So how do you fight for that legislatively? What are the barriers, step by step, that have to be broken down in order for people to really successfully reintegrate?
Well, in my mind, it all stems from the criminal record itself. And so we need to get rid of that criminal record as soon as possible, and or make, formerly incarcerated people a protected class. We don't necessarily have the political will to do that yet. And so every,
What do you mean by a protected class? Sorry.
well, I think it should be illegal to discriminate against formerly incarcerated people, to have the same, human rights met that everybody else needs. You can't discriminate based on race, based on sexual orientation, based on gender anymore, based on disability status, in housing and employment and all these other things. I think that eventually we need to have formerly incarcerated people not be able to be lawfully discriminated against.
So does that take a legislative amendment, do you think, or a federal amendment, or at least a state amendment?
I mean, I think we can get there through a state amendment, but I would love to see it be a federal effort as well. Maybe Washington will get there sooner than other states, and it will help the federal government follow course. But in the meantime, I'm working to get rid of that criminal record as soon as possible, through efforts to vacate criminal records, basically expunge your criminal record. Right now, that's tied to your ability to pay your legal financial obligations. And so I have a bill this session around, getting rid of more legal financial obligations, and so people can vacate their criminal records. We are trying to do automatic record vacating, clean slate initiative. Has been going on around the country. Unfortunately, here in Washington State, we're facing some problems because of our ununified court system in that regard. But all of this, right now, I'm also just fighting for things like, we've made some progress in some professions and with some professional licenses, but healthcare jobs continue to be, cut off to formerly incarcerated people. And so I have a bill making some progress towards healthcare jobs for people with criminal records. Yeah.
Well, there's one thing to, not everybody who gets out of prison is going to want to run for office or maybe even vote. I mean, what they want is a job. They want housing. They want to be back with their families. And a lot of the discrimination or the stigma that's associated with getting back to normal is at the private level of private businesses, level of, social life and family. How do you overcome the barriers to that? I mean, what needs to be done in that area?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's a personal journey, right? Of coming to grips with my trauma history, becoming a person that my children can rely on, that they know I'm going to show up when I say I'm going to show up, I'm going to be there, and that just takes a lot of time, and building relationships and being open and honest, and some of that reunification with your families and rebuilding your private life. Is really about personal transformation, which, I found to be the most helpful things were the self-organizing work that prisoners did together to really address the root cause of what brought us to prison to begin with, and getting rid of some of the shame associated with our childhood circumstances and the violence that we survived. And so it's a lifelong process of healing to show up and reunify with your family and your community in a really thoughtful way. And the more you do it, the more trust you build, and the better things get.
Were you shocked when you got out and thought that, hey, it's going to be easy, I'm now back, I've done my time, I've paid my debt to society, but nobody's listening to me and nobody's taking that seriously?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really dehumanizing, and it continues to re-trigger the trauma that we are facing every day as formerly incarcerated people. When
tell us a little bit about that from your own personal experiences.
Absolutely. Like even something as simple as applying for a place to live, and talking to the landlord and then paying the $40, which is not easy to come by when you're basically sentenced to minimum wage jobs. And then, the landlord engaging in a conversation, and then, telling you after they run the background check that, I'm sorry, but we can't rent to you because of your criminal record. Just the overwhelming pain and despair that I went through early in my reentry, and having to go and live with my sponsor in my 12-step program, and send my son to go live with his father, and being, basically separated from my child again when I had already been separated for so long in prison. The pain of those things is, can really weigh you down. I mean, obviously it did cause a lot of pain for me during those times, and it was just my commitment to make a better life for my son, and that helped me persevere through all of that.
Some people argue that having at least a couple of months, maybe a year of preparation in prison before you get out would help enormously in adjusting to life outside. Was there any of that when you were inside?
I mean, there wasn't a lot offered by the actual prison. I, did a lot of it on my own by going to volunteer programs, faith-based programs, recovery programs, and things like that, and tried to build my own kind of connection. I didn't have a family to come home to. My parents, have suffered themselves. Everyone in my family has suffered with substance use disorder and been incarcerated. So I kind of had to build my own kind of support network through community. And, I did go to work release for 4 months before I got out. And that helped me get my, fast food job. It was something. It was better than scrubbing toilets for 42 cents an hour, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't going to be enough to, get my own children out of poverty. So
Have you kept in touch with some of the people who you're inside with who've gotten out and have they been able to make it?
absolutely. One of my two of my dearest friends are, getting their master's degrees, are in the movement with me here in Washington State, doing criminal justice reform work. I've kept in touch with several of my friends that I met when I was in prison.
These are great success stories, but we never hear about them. You
Yeah.
hear about the vast majority of folks who get out in Washington State and other states are usually condemned to the kind of life you had when you first got outside.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people in Washington State, do you have any idea, are in the same situation you were in? They've gotten out and they're facing the ban the box. They're facing all these barriers. Do you have a figure for how many folks are in that situation in Washington?
The ones that have made it, or the ones
that haven't made it? I mean, the ones that are basically out of prison with a criminal record and really stuck and haven't been able. Is there any sort of? I know we have something like 3 million people in America who have criminal records. That's a huge number. But if we broke it down by states, what's the situation in Washington State? Is it particularly worse than others?
Well, I would say, our recidivism rate is, somewhere around 35% of people go back to prison within 3 years, right? Yeah. And I'll say, I think about, 50% go back within 5 years. I would estimate, about 70% of people that coming out of prison are caught in poverty. There are some success stories, but it's too few. And we need to keep making success the norm instead of the exception.
Making success the norm. That's a really nice way to put it. What would make it easier? I mean, what is it? Legislation? Is it changing social attitudes? Obviously, you can't legislate for that. But what steps, including some of the ones that you're involved in now, would make the whole reentry process easier, and certainly in your state?
Well, there's a lot of things. First, we have to stop over punishing people and not sentencing them to longer than they need. And the community corrections and the probation system needs to be quality instead of quantity of time. And so we are working through that, legislatively right now, to reduce the time that people are on probation and instead increasing the quality. A lot of this stuff can be done through budget investments too. We really need to invest with our money in Washington State into successful reentry, whether that's extending housing vouchers for people when they are released, making sure that everybody should have a year of rent paid. Housing is the number one kind of protective factor against recidivism. If you kick people out of prison homeless and expect them not to come back, that's not going to work. You have to make sure everybody has housing and has some stability in their housing situation so they can address other issues and reconnect, with their community and their families, and find employment or go through job training. Right now we are, there's a bill going through the legislature I'm a co-sponsor of to increase access to post-secondary education while people are in prison. I think education investments while folks are incarcerated, huge protective factor against recidivism. And having that, what we really need is more case managers instead of probation officers. So really trying to change the culture of probation officers and/or give folks a mentor, a credible messenger, a case manager when they're coming out to help them overcome all these barriers.
How would you describe the climate for change right now in Washington State? Obviously, you won, I think it was 65% of the vote. Nobody knew about you when you first threw your hat in the ring, and then you were in and you got, I guess, votes from across the aisle as well. So does that mean Washington State is a bit more amenable to changing the facts of life for people who are on probation or people getting out of prison in other states?
I would say I believe so. And we do, with everything that happened in 2020 also, there's a huge priority in my caucus for racial equity. And all of these issues are very much racially disproportionate. And so the more we can tie the need for criminal legal system reform to our really embarrassing racial disparities within our criminal legal system here in Washington State, that is good. And people are committed to making progress on racial equity. And this is a racial justice issue as well. So, I do think that we have some really good conditions right now to make progress. We are also facing a huge budget crisis. And yes, so some of my efforts are really about sentencing reform and retroactive sentencing reform and getting people out of prison. I mean, right now we have COVID exploding in our prisons. 5,900 incarcerated folks have contracted the disease because they can't socially distance. And then we have the racial justice uprising. We have the budget crisis. So honestly, right now, we're also looking at sentencing reform retroactively, getting people out to save money and also protect people against COVID-19 and decrease our racial disparities.
Does it still feel that you've got bipartisan support for this?
It depends. Not so much most of the time. Unfortunately, there is some bipartisan support for some of the reforms, really mostly about like jobs for formerly incarcerated people. But so far this session, I haven't been able to garner a lot of bipartisan support, which is really unfortunate.
Because justice reform is one of the few bipartisan areas of agreement, and it has been in the last 5 years.
What's that?
It has been one of the few areas of bipartisan agreement, at least even in the past government, past administration.
Yeah, before I joined the legislature, I was able to get a few things through in a bipartisan way. But they're really on the periphery, maybe in the reentry space, but not so much in the sentencing space. My voting rights bill, which is going to restore the right to vote for every person as soon as they exit 24-hour confinement within prison. So even if you go to a work release, if you're out of custody on community custody, probation, even if you haven't been able to pay off your legal financial obligations, people will have their right to vote back. I did get a Republican co-sponsor on that, so I'm hopeful. We'll see. It's going to be voted off the House floor here soon, and we'll see how much bipartisan support I can get. But I am not giving up. I believe in bipartisan support. I believe in building that, and I hope I can continue to do that.
So in the time we have left, let's look at the national picture for a bit. I mean, how do you see this translating into a national CD? I mean, other states are moving in different directions. Some of them are moving in the same direction that Washington State is. Do you see there being more opportunities on a national level for the kind of justice reform that you're trying to do in Washington?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I hope that this will continue. I mean, under the previous administration, we did get some progress with, like the First Step Act. And so I'm hoping that advocates can, capitalize on that momentum and continue to make progress, especially under the new administration where, banning private prisons was something that recently happened under the executive order. I think, having the first Black woman as a vice president will really help as well. And I've been, watching a little bit, but not so much at the federal level because I've been really invested here in the legislature and learning my new job in the last 6 weeks. But I remain hopeful that we have conditions right now across the nation because of what happened in 2020, especially to make more progress.
What's on your wish list for the federal government to do over the next 1 year, the next 4 years?
Gosh, reduce its prison population by 50%. Really going back and doing, broad reforms retroactively to get people out who have been there for way too long. We obviously need to do a lot more. Right now, one thing that's really upsetting too is that if you're convicted of a federal crime, you don't have a right to have your record expunged at all. And so, I have several friends who have federal convictions who are amazing individuals. I mean, really amazing, have, overcome so much and have been so successful and can never, go on a field trip with their kids. Even 20 years later, we absolutely need to have some legislation to end the punishment.
So here's a journalistic question. Every time you're talked about or described, you have the tag of former incarceree, first former incarceree to win a state state office. Up to a point, that begins to be a limiting kind of tag, doesn't it? I mean, if you're always identified as a former incarceree, and we find that very often with people saying, well, you can't keep identifying me by what I did wrong. So what would you advise journalists when they're covering issues or even individuals who've been in the same position as you? What do they need to know in order to cover it with a certain degree of honesty and transparency and accuracy?
Yeah. Well, I don't mind, formerly incarcerated. One thing that really, really irks me is when journalists and editors use dehumanizing language in their headlines. Felon, convict, offender. I really hope that they stop using that kind of language. We are people. Person who was convicted now is an attorney, now is a state representative. That's fine. But please stop using dehumanizing terms and, get educated about appropriate
very
language.
good advice. Do you have any connections you're making now with your colleagues, your peers in other state legislatures? Do you have any sense of people working in the same pace and depth that you are?
Before I was elected, my representative, who actually encouraged me to run for her seat, to carry on her legacy, she was the chair of the Public Safety Committee for the Council of State Governments West. And so I did go to a couple of conferences and have met some other legislators in mostly the Western states, Hawaii, Alaska, California, Colorado, who are working on these issues. But I've been on the job now for 6 weeks and it's been a virtual world, so I haven't been able to connect much. I'm really excited to grow those relationships over the interim and over the next few years and see what we can come up with together.
Well, I know you've got to run, Representative Simmons. I want to thank you again for joining us and for giving us the time. This is wonderful, and good luck to you. And I hope we'll stay in touch. We'll keep your contact information on our records, so any journalists who want to contact you or speak to you will be able to.
All right.
Thank you again very much, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.